Yeah, good morning. Thank you for inviting me to this conference. Special word of thanks to Dr. Gautam Sinha, my old friend, Dr. Kalyani, also old friend and colleague, and thank you for setting up this conference on such an important theme. So I would be talking about the role of startups in moving from jugaad to systematic innovation. As was introduced by Dr. Kalyani in her opening remarks, startups play a very important role in innovation, and particularly in India since about 2013-14, we are seeing a growing importance of startups in the Indian economy. But if startups are to continue to play a critical role, there are certain important steps they need to take as far as innovation is concerned. And I would like to focus my talk on some of those steps. If you look at the evolution of the Indian innovation ecosystem over time, you will see that some interesting things have happened. Since we went in for economic deregulation in early 1990s, the incentive to innovate for firms has gone up. Competition has increased. Innovative firms are getting better valuation in the market. If you innovate, there is a potential to grow fast. But there are two other areas where we have not progressed as well. One is in the capacity of individual firms to innovate, and the second is the availability of inputs for the innovation process. Now, what we know is that through a lot of policy measures, the government is trying to change the situation as far as the inputs are concerned. So we have Atal Innovation Mission and other similar initiatives taken by the government, which are trying to address the inputs issue. But the capacity to innovate issue continues to be a serious challenge. And that's because this is something which needs to happen inside the organization. So here we have a whole range of organizations. We have, of course, our large corporations, which have been around for many years. And of course, we have medium-sized companies. And then we have small companies and startups. And what we have been seeing in recent years is that startups play an increasingly important role in driving the innovation activities. We also know that in India, we have traditionally been strong in certain more informal approaches to innovation. For example, we have been strong at some of the jugaad kind of methods, where we have been good at improvising with locally available materials and resources to solve the problems that we face in day-to-day life. But we also know that over time, there have been some challenges in just relying on jugaad, because jugaad tends to be based on individual ingenuity. It doesn't have a strong scientific or engineering base. In other words, it's more a craft than a science. It's often not the best way of solving complex problems. It tends to be difficult to scale. And one important change that has happened in the last 20 years is that the expectations of users and customers have changed considerably. No user or customer today is happy to rely on a product or service that is not reliable, not high quality, does not give a good user experience. So some of the old Jugaad solutions, which were kind of makeshift kind of ways of solving problems, are no longer suitable because customers are not willing to accept them. And perhaps the turning point for that was the Nokia 1100 handphone, which was launched maybe 15 years back or so, which showed that robust quality and a low price can actually go together. So ever since then, customers have been very clear that we are not going to make do with a solution to a problem unless it is of the highest quality and delivers a user experience. So my talk today is essentially focused on what are some of the things startups can do to develop innovation capabilities. What are some of the things they need to keep in mind? This is based on a book that I wrote with Vinay Dabolkar of some years back called 8 Steps to Innovation, which was mentioned in my introduction. And basically in that book, we try to address a very simple problem, we try to address a problem of how do you build a systematic innovation capability. What is the systematic innovation capability? It is the ability to innovate on a continuing basis, not by chance or luck, but by deliberate and structured efforts within the organization. And in that book, we address three main problems. We address what we call the pipeline problem, the challenge of generating enough ideas. We addressed a problem called the velocity problem, which is the challenge of making sure that ideas are worked on and progress going forward. And we address the batting average problem, which is how do you enhance the impact of ideas that you generate within the organization. And to answer these three challenges, we came up with 8 steps. We said you need to address the pipeline problem by laying a foundation for innovation, building what we call a challenge book, which is identifying the right problems to solve, building organizational participation, that is getting people in the organization to be part of the innovation process. We came up with some methods to address the velocity problem, which basically we talked about experimenting at low cost, high speed, going fast from a prototype to incubation, and iterating on the business model. And finally, to address the batting average problem, we advocated using innovation sandbox platforms and open innovation and creating a margin of safety in the innovation process. So I will not be going into detail in all these steps, but let me just focus on a few of the steps which I think are most important from a startup perspective. Because remember, the topic I have chosen for today's talk is trying to understand how startups can be more innovative on a systematic basis. So let's start looking first at the pipeline. Let's start looking at the ideation process. So one important point I would like to underline here is that choosing the right problems to solve is one of the most important things that a startup can do. Many times I find that startups are struggling because the problems they have solved are not real problems. They are problems which have been chosen because the startup already has a technology or solution. In other words, what you might call solution searching for a problem. And therefore, many of the problems do not present robust customer or user needs. Instead, it's better if your problem is identified in a different way. Let me give you an example of a company called Vigyan Labs, which is no longer a startup. Now it's a young company based in Mysore. In 2013, it got the Innovation Award from NASCOM. And the interesting thing about Vigyan Labs is they chose very interesting problem to solve. Many of us know that today a lot of computing is shifted to the cloud. But just because computing has shifted to the cloud, it doesn't mean there are no computers. There are large banks of servers located in data centers. And these data centers have now been identified as one of the biggest sources of pollution and greenhouse gases. In fact, some estimates suggest that data centers can waste as much as 90% or more of the electricity they put off the grid. So this is the problem which Vigyan Labs try to solve. They try to solve the problem of huge amount of power wastage in data centers. And the way they went about it, they looked at three things. They saw there's a pain point, which is the huge consumption of power. There is a wave, which is the shift of computing to data centers. And there is an issue of waste, which is the huge power wastage. So essentially, what I'm arguing here is that the right problem, the problem that represents pain of customers or users, it represents a wave in terms of a trend in demographics, in society, in technology, etc. And it represents a waste. We just saw the example of Yan Lab where they were facing a problem where a lot of power was being wasted. So the first suggestion I would like to make startups is make sure you have the right problem to solve. And one way of identifying the right problem is look for a problem that represents pain, wave, and waste. We repeat, pain, wave, and waste. So essentially what we find is many times Particularly startup entrepreneurs are very enamored with technology, but technology should not be the starting or driving point for startup. It's only when technology is linked to the market that you are likely to have a successful startup. You can just see these examples. You look at BlackBerry, which at one time was one of the most widely used smartphones. It was successful because it offered a powerful solution corporate concerns of security regarding using email on a handphone. Look at Apple. Apple's initial success came because Steve Jobs realized users were looking for a smooth, integrated, intuitive multimedia experience and, of course, connections with a number of applications. And of course, you can look at Google, which of course is very strong on technology, but went one step further than Apple by providing all this and more on an open platform. So remember, pain, wave, and waste to identify the right problem and make sure that technology and market are aligned with each other. Otherwise, it will be quite difficult to build a successful startup. The second important idea I would like to underline in this morning's talk is the importance of experimentation. What is an experiment? An experiment is any activity that validates assumptions. So it's very important that a startup does a number of experiments to validate the different assumptions it may have made. What kind of assumptions are we talking about here? There could be assumptions on the need, there could be assumptions on the technology, there could be assumptions on how the product or service will be produced, and there are assumptions on how it will go to market or what is the method of commercialization. So ideally, any startup needs to test out and validate all these assumptions before it goes forward. For example, it needs to find out whether product or service it is offering really meets the need of a customer, or whether the way it is formulated its business model is going to be aligned with the needs of customers. So what is important is for you to be able to go through these experimentation cycles pretty fast. Some of you might have seen a movie called The Social Network, which is a fictional account of Mark Zuckerberg setting up Facebook in his Harvard dorm room. If you go back and see that movie again, what you will realize is the quick speed with which Mark and his team went through various experimentation loops. The first loop they went with is trying to make sure that the idea they had could actually translate into a good user experience for the customer. And the second one they were looking at is, okay, can we now find a way of looking at how we can finally monetize this? So these were done pretty fast. In fact, in just about 6 months, they had a whole system which was tested and was able to deliver value to customers. So essentially, as I was saying, you need to be able to test each of the assumptions. Example, the need. Will people use the internet? Technology. Do we have the technology to create internet plans? Production. Can we scale this? Commercialization. Can we monetize this? So this example, of course, is for an app-based business. You could apply similar kind of logic to any kind of startup business that you have in mind. And remember that today, experimentation is no longer a luxury, it has become an imperative. Earlier, when companies had to test out their concept, they used to sit down with customer focus groups. This is particularly true, say, in the case of consumer goods. Or they would, internally try to decide which features to implement, polling their employees. But remember, in the digital and internet business, neither need to depend on focus groups, nor do you need to use internal committees to decide features. Because you have the ability at low cost to constantly experiment, test new ideas, measure customer response, and then based on the customer response, decide whether to go forward or not. In all of this, there are two important types of experiments any startup needs to do uh, in almost equal measure. The first one is the divergent one, where you're essentially doing open-ended experimentation or testing. You put a prototype in the hands of customers, you see how the customer uses it, you pose open-ended questions. In fact, the users may reply by asking you more questions. So this is divergent experimentation. This is in the early stage of the innovation process when you're trying to generate a lot of options. But as you proceed with your development of the product, service, or technology, you need to do more convergent experimentation. Should I have feature A or should I have feature B? If I'm running, let's say, an online food delivery, should I give a discount to customers or should I give them a coupon which allows them to redeem at a later date? Which is better? So essentially, you've got to test these features through a scientific and experimental design, ask a precise question, a finite set of questions, and do an actual experiment to find out the answer. This is the big difference between digital and indirect businesses and physical businesses. On a digital business, you can try things out. That's why companies like Zomato, Ola, Swiggy, any company you take, they are constantly trying out experiments on their apps and on their websites to understand which is a better option to provide customers. And based on actual usage pattern, they are deciding which features to include and which not to include. In fact, as David Rogers says in his book, The Digital Transformation Playbook, innovate successfully, you need both convergent and divergent experiments at different stages and in different parts of your business. Successful innovation must balance both exploratory learning to generate and develop new ideas and confirmatory learning to verify and refine ideas. When you do this well, you can not only, of course, be more aligned with what the market is looking for, you can also cut down the time involved in the innovation cycle. And in fact, increasingly, we are seeing that companies that innovate through rapid experimentation bring down the innovation cycle by a significant degree. You can see why that happens, which is depicted in this particular figure. Finally, as far as experimentation is concerned, there's another intriguing idea you might like to keep in mind, which is, can you do the last experiment first? What does this mean? You remember I told you that testing assumptions is one of the most important things that a startup has to do. But perhaps what is even more important is to test the most critical assumptions first. That is what is meant by doing the last experiment first. Test the assumptions which will be make or break, or which will determine your success or failure as early as possible. Let me give you a quick example. Many years ago, when internet e-commerce was first starting, there was a young entrepreneur who thought he would sell shoes online. When he told his friends that he was going to sell shoes online, his friends laughed at him. They told him, "You must be crazy. Nobody will buy a shoe online because when someone goes to a shoe store, they want to try on the shoe and see whether it's comfortable or not. And how can they do that online?" So this young entrepreneur realized that if he wants to make his online shoe store work, he needs to figure out whether people will indeed be willing to buy shoes online or not. That was the most critical assumption he needed to test. Is online shoe sale going to happen or not? So without making a very huge investment in back end, in supply chain, in logistics, etc., what this entrepreneur did was create a very simple experiment, put up a very simple web page with a very simple payment engine, and just put up a small catalog of shoes based on shoes available with the local shoe store. Every time he got an order, he just went and picked up the shoes from the shoe store and cleared it to the customer. This way, he was able to test out what kind of shoes people were willing to buy online and what they were not willing to buy online. And this experiment, this last experiment first, ultimately became a very successful startup called Zappos.com, which was later acquired by Amazon. Let me just proceed towards the end of my talk by talking a little bit about what does systematic innovation mean in the digital era. Are there any additional things we need to keep in mind? Some of the things we need to keep in mind in the digital era, the need to make intelligent use of artificial intelligence and machine learning. One of the big strengths of artificial intelligence is that it is both a general purpose technology, like a motor or a microprocessor were in earlier generations, but it's also a new method of invention. It provides a new method to solve problems. And you all know that through artificial intelligence, you can expand the playbook. You can open up new problems to solve. You can automate the discovery process. So this constitutes a completely new method of addressing invention. So AI is very powerful because it combines both of these. It is a general purpose technology as well as a method of invention. And you can see this can be very powerful. Look at a startup like Niramai, which is based here in Bangalore. One of the big challenges in India is that breast cancer is a top cause of cancer deaths in women. Breast cancer is quite curable if it's detected early, but early detection doesn't happen for a number of societal reasons. So one of the big challenges is how do you do early detection? And this is where Niramai is using a very simple method, which is non-invasive, which is not dangerous, which is thermal image processing. Thermal image processing normally is not very accurate by itself, but when used with machine learning algorithms, it can become 97, 98% reliable and accurate. This enables a low-cost, accurate, automated, portable cancer screening tool that can be operated by a simple clinician. It overcomes many of the privacy as well as the uh, danger or safety related issues which come up from traditional methods of screening for breast cancer. The other important element of the digital economy, which is important to look at in systematic innovation today, is the use of data. So data can be a big complement to customer immersion. You remember I started my talk by talking about the importance of understanding customer needs. Today, data allows you to identify customer needs and do better alignment with customers without necessarily directly immersing yourself in the lives of customers. Bajaj Finserv is a great example of a company in India that does this extremely well. As many of you might know, Bajaj Finserv is in the personal finance business. It gives personal loans to people, even small ticket loans. And they have done this these days largely through the mobile without necessarily personal interaction with customers, but with very low delinquency rates. How do they do this? They have issued EMI cards to millions of consumers. They therefore have good record of their uh, repayment and their consumer behavior. They also monitor their CIBIL score, but they also collect data from data bureaus like Equifax. They pool the data from Equifax with the data which they use, which is generated from the EMI card they have issued. And from this, they are able to make a very good credit appraisal of a customer, sometimes in less than a couple of months. And as I said, this enables them to be very accurate their customer credit assessment. So essentially, they are able to give loans to customers who need them, but also at very low NPA percentages, which means the company is able to be quite successful in the finance business. So this is the power of data in the modern economy. So let me just try to sum up the key points I made. Choose the right problem to solve. This is critical. Gain, wave, and waste are very useful triggers to find the right problem. Following a market-driven process reduces risk and improves chances of success. So always move from outside to inside, identify customer and user needs and then come up with a solution, or iterate rapidly between the market and internal processes to make sure there is a close alignment. In your business, identify the key assumptions you have made regarding need, technology, production, and commercialization. Test these assumptions through a systematic process. pivot if the assumptions are not upheld, and of course, increasingly engage with some of the digital methods like AI and ML, use more of data, try to integrate data with your customer need identification process so that you are able to align with customer needs, low cost and in real time, which enables you to be more successful in your startup. So let me stop there. I don't know whether your format has any provision for questions. If you have provisions for questions, I'm happy to take some questions. If there's no provision for questions, thank you for your patient hearing, and I will end my talk now. Thank you.
Should we allow questions, sir?
Yeah, please. Krishnan has the time, then we have the information.
Anybody has questions can come and ask. I will ask one question. Professor Krishnan, what should corporates do to build an innovative culture in organizations? This is my question.
Yeah, so I think by now we have a fairly good idea of what it takes to build an innovation culture. I think one of the most important things is to be receptive to ideas from employees and other stakeholders. The first important step. Many companies have now created methods of doing this, including hackathons, media portals, and other methods to facilitate or to encourage people to share their ideas with the company. But just sharing ideas is not good enough. What happens next with the ideas is very important. Does the company have processes in place to support the ideas which are good? Do they have funds available to take ideas forward? They have testing facilities to enable testing of the ideas. Are they willing to give employees time off from their normal job to work with the ideas and take them forward? Is there support for experimentation? For example, if employees fail, hopefully that should not be held against them. You need to create a culture where failing is fine. So companies need to work hard on that. Need to have mentors and champions who can help people coming up with ideas navigate the organizational challenges, bureaucracy. These are all, I mean, there are many things, but I think it's fairly well documented by now. So these are all some of the things you can do to build an innovative culture with your organization.
Sir, to ask, sir. Anyone has a question? You can introduce yourself.
Good morning, Professor Krishnan.
Yeah, good morning.
Professor, I have a question. How do we develop a sandbox environment in the field of academia? I think innovation goes very much in the corporate, in the business front, but then how do we innovate in academia?
Yeah, so I think innovation in academia is not very different. First thing I would suggest is you identify what are some of the key problems or challenges you are facing. We have several good examples in the last 1 year of COVID. Most of us had to shift very quickly to online education, which we did not have so much experience in. So if you had taken that as a problem, maybe about a year back, that would have been a good problem to work with. Second thing, you need to encourage, of course, a lot of ideas. So this is something I just explained in the answering the earlier question, what can be done to facilitate generating a lot of ideas. Then you need to also facilitate experimentation with those ideas. So whatever be your quality mechanisms within the university, you need to also allow certain degree of experimentation. So if somebody comes up with a new pedagogy or comes up with a new kind of approach, you have to give them a chance to try them out, and you should not hold it against them if they fail the first time. You need to be supportive of that the first time. So I think the logic and the process is very much the same. So we need to provide very similar kind of support as we would provide in a corporate environment. Of course, we should probably involve these students also in the process. because unless they are also enthusiastic participants in the innovation process, it is unlikely that this kind of innovation will be effective. So we should probably be open with them as well and include them and make them partners in the innovation process. In fact, we should be open to ideas and suggestions from them as well.
Thank you, Professor Krishnan.
Rangarajan here.
Good morning.
How are you? Acha, the point that you really mentioned about innovation or inventions being prevented, prohibited, what shall I say, the heads of type still continues, particularly with the top management in most organizations, particularly in academia. I have faced this myself, and we are also facing it in various other places. I mean, is there a governmental intervention that is possible to tell these people, please off with your, I mean, don't scare them away, don't chop their head, etc., etc.
So I leave it to you to decide whether government will help or hinder the process.